What's up? This is Brent Vaarstra from LearnJazzStandards.com, and you're listening to the Musicality podcast.
Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hi, this is Christopher, founder of Musicality, and welcome to the Musicality podcast. On the show today, I'm joined by Brent Vaarstra from LearnJazzStandards.com, one of the leading websites for people to learn to play jazz. Now, if you're not into jazz, you might already be thinking about skipping this episode. Don't. This conversation tackles exactly that question of whether jazz has anything to offer musicians who aren't necessarily dedicated to jazz, and also the core skills you can learn to help you find musical freedom in jazz or any other genre. Brent has been running Learn Jazz Standards since 2011, publishing new articles and podcast episodes every week. He also performs and teaches around New York and is the author of jazz books for Hal Leonard, including 500 Jazz Licks and Visual Improvisation for Jazz Guitar. I wanted to have Brent on the show to pick his brains about what does or doesn't make jazz unique as a genre, and particularly to ask him a few questions that frequently come up among Musical U followers and members on the topic of jazz. We talk about if jazz is an advanced genre, or one you can start with right away, whether being a good jazz musician requires mastery of complex music theory or having an incredible ear, and how to start training your musical ear for jazz or any other genre, and Brent shares his 4-step system for doing that. We also talk about the new ear training course from Learn Jazz Standards, and the two things that I think really set it apart. Brent has kindly set up a terrific freebie for our listeners that can help you get started with musical ear training. Stay tuned to the end of the conversation to learn more about that and how to get your hands on it. My name's Christopher Sutton, and this is the Musicality podcast from Musical U. Welcome to the show, Brent. Thank you for joining us today.
Christopher, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here and share some knowledge with your audience.
Terrific. So I'd love to start at the beginning, if we may, and talk a little bit about how you first got started learning music.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I didn't come from a musical family at all, really. There wasn't a lot of music going around, so I'm not entirely sure where it came from, but I just always, since I was a kid, was always really fascinated with music. I just loved it, and I loved listening to it. I loved when I saw musicians playing wherever I was at, if it was at a restaurant or, I always just thought it was really interesting. And so I saved up money. My parents were really good about, helping me out, but, you got to save for it if you really want it. They wanted to sort of vet me. Do you really want to learn how to play an instrument? And for me, that was the guitar. So I got my first guitar when I was 10 years old. It was like a $300 acoustic guitar. I remember buying it from this particular music store and just going home right away and playing it, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I was just exploring different sounds and just kind of mesmerized by the process. And I think I got a guitar teacher eventually who mysteriously disappeared one day. He just didn't show up for the lesson and never saw him again. So I don't know what happened with that, but kind of after that, I got my footing there with learning how to play the guitar, some introduction to navigating the instrument, and just kind of kept going from there myself. And sporadically, as I continue my training, just learning on my own and discovering my own musical vision and moving forward from there. So that's kind of the very beginning roots of how it all started for me.
That's fascinating, and I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot more about jazz and the idea of having a musical ear. It sounds like you started out with an ear-based approach. You said you were exploring and trying things out on guitar. Is that right? Were you learning mostly by ear?
Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, obviously, every musician or every instrument, rather, when people learn to play it, for some reason, there's lots of different approaches to it. And, I find like piano players, they tend to be reading out of books right away and they're learning how to read notation. And traditionally, at least in, this age, I guess you could call it, a lot of guitar players don't really learn by reading music, but I did learn how to read chord symbols and chord charts and lead sheets and things like this. But yeah, it was very much so primarily by ear. And I became very interested in music that was, I guess, music that pushed the creative boundaries. And I don't know if it was my personality or what it was, but I became really interested in progressive rock. I'm talking about bands like Rush and even Pink Floyd. There, I would consider them to be in that topic there. And then, heavier bands like Dream Theater, Planet X, things like this, bands that really had this improvisational freedom and elastic feeling to them, and a story being told in music. And I was just really drawn to that. And I think that led me to those records and just sitting down by ear, because there's no music for that. So I was just trying to figure out all that stuff myself. So long story short, yeah, I've always been driven to learn things by ear.
That's so interesting. And I think it gives a real insight into where you're coming from as a jazz musician and a jazz educator, because I think a lot of people in our audience probably associate jazz with learning by ear and improvising.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting to hear that even though now you are someone teaching other people that kind of skill, actually from your own background, that was something you picked up along the way teaching yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. And jazz was something I really found. When I think about it, there's a lot of things that got me into jazz, but it really just started with appreciating it. I think like a lot of people from my generation or even generations before me, learning about jazz is something that could happen in, your junior high school or high school band class, which I was certainly part of. And just being exposed to jazz in that sense and just being interested by it. It's not necessarily that I loved it at first. I think a lot of people have that relationship with jazz is, it's something that really has to be focused on and listened to and appreciated to really get the full value out of it. So I think it started out by just being exposed to it, but coming from that background of progressive rock and this virtuosic element of music, and who knows what's going to happen? What's going to happen next in the music? I don't know. And I think that curiosity kind of pushed me a little further into being interested in jazz.
And apart from the kind of mythological or maybe idealized vision of the jazz musician who's born with a trumpet in their hand and just kind of wails from day one, I think a lot of people would say jazz is something that does require quite a formal education to really have your head around what it means to play jazz and how to do it at the highest level. Were you entirely self-taught before you became a professional jazz musician, or was there some formal training involved along the way?
I did have like sporadic lessons in there where I would go find. Are you talking specifically jazz or just music in general?
Music in general, I suppose.
Okay, yeah, I would have sporadic lessons where I would meet somebody and be like, hey, I'd like to take a lesson with you. And I would take several lessons, but it was never something like really long-term. I would just learn something, like a little lesson and go from there. And yeah, certainly when I was in high school, I took some music theory classes. And of course, we're going a little further down the story here, but in college, of course, I was really immersed in that stuff. But in general, yeah, it kind of started with learning myself. But when it comes to jazz, it just so happened to be that I got involved in a community of people in my town. I grew up in Boise, Idaho, which is a place where there's, and I mean no offense to anybody who's listening who lives in Idaho, but there's not as much music there as, for example, where I live here in New York City. It was a great place to grow up, but there wasn't as much musical exposure. And to find a pocket of musicians there who were really hardcore about jazz was almost lucky in a sense. I had a friend who was actually in a progressive rock band that I was in high school, which we had a blast doing. We, practicing every single Saturday, and we were nerds about it. It was so great. And I have a lot of great memories from that time. But the keyboard player was meeting this teacher who was kind of like, for lack of better terms, the guru, the jazz guru out in my city, my smaller city in Idaho. And my friend kind of introduced me to him and got me involved with him. And there was an art school that he was starting up. And so for my senior year of high school, I was actually going part-time to my local public school and then part-time to this art school, and kind of being integrated into this small community. The school was just starting up, so it was just like trailers, basically. Like my practice room and the classrooms were like trailers, and we'd pile in there, and classes were, combo classes and private lessons and at like 3 hours of practice time during the day. It was great. And I think that setting, as far as jazz goes, is kind of what got me really wrapped up into it. So certainly at that point, really getting a teacher, a mentor, but also just being in a community, because I think that's really where music of all styles, not just jazz, but music of all styles really comes to life, is within a community where you start getting influenced by others, listening to the music that they're listening to. And so that's kind of where that developed into for me.
And what did the next few years look like once you were into that community? How did you go on to become a professional jazz musician?
That's a great question, Christopher, because that's sort of like the pivotal, my life took a change. I mean, that's where I see how things really changed for me. I started getting really into jazz, and I mean really hardcore into jazz. Like, I listened to records all day long, all night long. Going to the art school I was just telling you about, I would be listening to the music. I was learning all the tunes that everybody was doing. We had a jam session once a week at this local coffee shop, and everybody from the school would show up. We would all play together, that community I was talking to you about. And I was just really inspired and really energized. And this is when I was about 18 years old, 17, 18 years old. That's where I really started coming into this place where I was like, I love all kinds of music, but this jazz thing is just what I'm really excited about right now. And I was looking to apply to colleges. I wanted to go to college for music, even though everybody told me not to. I was very stubborn and said, "Nah, forget about it. I'm gonna do this anyways. I don't care what you say." Though my parents were very supportive, and every college I got into, every single college that I wanted to get into, that I applied for, the problem was, the funds weren't really there. I wasn't getting enough scholarship money, and I didn't have that money to go to school, and I was really discouraged. I was trying to pull as many strings as possible, and it was just, for me, it was really heartbreaking, because I was seeing all of my other friends, societies all telling everybody, okay, now you go to college. That's what you do, at least in the community that I was a part of. And I felt like I was going to be left behind because I couldn't quite afford to go to the colleges that I wanted to go to. So one day at the art school, my teacher, my mentor, came up to me. He was like, "Hey, what's up? What's going on with college?" And I told him, "Hey, I just, you know what? I don't know what to do. I'm stuck. I can't afford it. I don't know what I'm going to do with my life after this." And what he told me, and it happened to be that my friend who introduced me to him, the guy that was the keyboard player in my progressive rock band, was kind of in the same spot too. And so what he told us is, he said, "Hey guys, I have this great idea for you. I've thought about your situations. What I want you to do, I know this sounds crazy. Maybe you have a hard time convincing your parents of this. I mean, but I'll meet with them. I'll do whatever it takes. But I want you to stay here for one whole year. And I'm going to set up a program for you guys. You're going to practice all day long. You're going to play your Monday night gig that you have. Keep doing that. You're going to teach some students to keep making some money, and you can volunteer at the school and stuff like this. And, I'm going to set this up for you, and you're just going to have this intensive, and we're going to have these big goals for your training. And then, we're going to reapply for these schools and get these scholarships." And that point in my life, things really took a dramatic turn where it was like, wow. And so for the next year, that's what I did. I just practiced and studied and did this program and went with my teacher for one whole year.
Wow. And that was all jazz focused, was it?
This was all jazz focused at the time. Yeah. Because it was really just trying to get into these particular conservatories and schools that were really jazz programs that I was going for.
Amazing. And was the goal there to get you to a higher level where you would have more options in terms of funding in university?
It was the goal. The goal was just to basically, not that I wasn't, a decent player at the time, but I wasn't anything spectacular, especially when it comes to jazz music, which, as you kind of alluded to earlier, can be a little bit brainy. It can be a little bit heavy. And so the idea was just to jumpstart those skills and to give a little more time. It hadn't been that long. I've been really training in jazz. So give a little more time and then see what happens. Of course, just the other side of things, me making a little bit of money from teaching guitar lessons to, get ready for going to college the next year. So yeah, that was the ultimate goal. And so if you don't mind, Christopher, I'll just tell you about the program that I was doing. It was kind of insane.
Please do.
The program was essentially, the goal was I needed to learn 100 jazz standards by the end of the year. So in a whole year, I had to learn 32 bars of a solo every single week. I had to, I don't know, I forgot what some of the other things were, like show a new voicing or a new thing that I learned to my teacher. But really the core of it was, it kind of, and I wouldn't say this is a good program for almost anybody to take, but this was the program that I was involved in, and it was, practice for 5 or 6 hours a day. All that sounds really impressive. I don't know that I would ever say that's the best thing for, like, I would say a large majority of people to do, but that's what I did. And I did that for a year. So it was just, and it truly was, it was a big jump start to my playing, my musicianship in general, and my jazz playing.
Wow. And if we can separate out into maybe, I don't know, instrument technique, ear training, music theory, and performance practice, what would the balance have been over the course of that year between those different areas? Or if I'm forgetting any important areas, let me know.
Yeah. I mean, actually, this particular teacher just really he wasn't really a theory person, which might come as a surprise to maybe some of your listeners. And so that was actually something that I lacked in knowledge, and I had to kind of gain a little bit later. It was really very heavy on learning things by ear, which I guess translates into ear training, not even necessarily fundamentals of ear training, which I truly believe are incredibly important, like recognizing intervals and being able to sing them and chords and hearing them and stuff like that. But it was more of a really immersed musical approach to that, where I was learning jazz language by learning solos by ear. And at the same time, that was building that connection from my brain to my instrument. And I was learning songs by ear. So it was training my ear to listen even more intentionally, intensely than ever before. It was a lot of hard work. And like I said, anybody listening right now and is just like completely like, okay, well, I'm never going to study jazz. Like, don't listen to anything I'm saying. I mean, it doesn't even have to be this way. Sort of. I'm probably starting off, confirming everybody's biggest fears, and it's just not true. But it's not true. But yeah, I would say, to answer your question, it was very ear training heavy in the sense that I was just learning lots of stuff by ear.
Gotcha. And that sounds like a pretty hardcore year. I imagine it had a happy ending.
It had a happy, yes, it had a happy ending. I did end up going to college. I went to Cornish College of the Arts in Seattle. It's a great art school. And I was there for a year, but then ultimately decided I wanted to be in New York City, where all the action was. And I moved out to New York City, was going to the City College of New York out there and up in Harlem, and studied with some great teachers. And the rest is history, I guess.
And we're going to talk a lot about learnjazzstandards.com in a little bit.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I would love to unpack just a couple of the things that came up there regarding jazz, because
Sure.
I think there are certainly some in our audience who are jazz musicians and probably know it inside out to some degree or another. But I know there are probably a lot of people in our audience too for whom jazz is quite unfamiliar and maybe quite intimidating. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of musicians think of jazz as an advanced genre. It's something particularly complicated, and they'd have to master, say, pop and rock before they ever thought about getting into jazz. But others I've come across are singularly jazz-minded. They know jazz is the only thing for them, and so they skip the pop and rock and anything more seemingly simple and dive straight into, bebop licks and 2-5-1s, and that's all they are interested in learning. What's your opinion on that? Would you say jazz is an advanced skill and you need to work on some easier stuff first, or is jazz something that you can dive straight into and make sense of?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot to unpack with what you just said. I'm forgetting some already, but one thing that you did say that I kind of want to debunk right away is those who are just about jazz and think, I'm just going to learn jazz and I'm just going to do all this stuff. You're making a big mistake, and it's fine to be someone like me where you're focused on jazz and that's just simply because you like it a lot, and that's totally fine and you're interested in that. But jazz may be complicated, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but also other styles of music are really complicated too. Like rock is complicated, pop is complicated, folk music is complicated. Like if you listen to the best musicians of all these styles, I mean, there's so much to learn. Like I can't play funk properly. I can fake it, but I'm not really playing it like someone who really knows how to do it. So I would say, just with that statement there, that, all music is worth diving into and spending a little bit of time on. And it's okay to be focused on one or the other, but always try to explore other styles, because you can learn so much. It can strengthen your playing. And to go in and to break off into the real main core of your question here is, do you need to learn other styles of music first before learning jazz? I don't necessarily think so. I think that for anything, to learn any style of music, you have to know the fundamentals of your instrument. And so that means just knowing how to get around it. Like, do you have to know all your scales? Of course not. But, do you know some of your scales? Because scales are a way we can organize the notes on our instrument. Are you able to play a basic chord? Whether you're a saxophone player just playing arpeggios, or a piano player playing actual block chords, can you do that? Like, and do you know how to play those chords in different keys? Like, those are some fundamentals of knowing your actual instrument. And I think if you know your actual instrument to some basic level, you can start, going out into other styles of music. And I think a lot of people think jazz is really complicated, but I think they overthink it a little bit. Like, it is complicated. There's a great reason to study jazz for any musician out there, and I'm not trying to sell it too hard, is simply that there's so much harmonic knowledge to be gained from it. So even if you're, let's say, a pop musician or a folk musician, if you learn a little bit of jazz, you can learn so much about how harmonies move. You can learn so much about, just voice leading, and these are terminologies that you may or may not be familiar with, but stuff that can help you become a better composer, stuff that can help you write better melodies. So I do think jazz is something that everybody can get into, and just to study a little bit of it can really grow everything else around it. So I don't want to say that it's so hard that you should learn other styles first. I think just see what you can get out of it. Try something, try taking a few lessons, like maybe learning how to play a seventh chord and you didn't know how to play a seventh chord before will open up your world to something brilliant. Maybe learning what a 2-5-1 chord progression is will be like, whoa, that's insane. I didn't know that that's how that worked. And it'll open up a system of how to build chord progressions in the first place. It's all these kinds of skills that you can learn from jazz. And it's okay if you're just dipping your foot in it. I hope that answers your question, Christopher.
It definitely does. I think that's such great advice to explain that, any genre can be complicated and any genre can be simple and accessible, and jazz is no exception. I think one reason musicians maybe feel like jazz is a bit further out of reach is that they are less exposed to it in regular culture. Like, unless you go seeking jazz, you're not going to hear it as much on the radio or on TV. And I know, like, certainly from my own experience, if you kind of take that first step of, I'd like to learn some jazz on my instrument, often the books or the courses kind of take for granted that your ears or your theory knowledge are already of a certain level. And I love that you broke it down there and said, actually, if you've got the basic instrument ability, that's enough to kind of start exploring this world of jazz and start drawing out some things that might be useful.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, having those fundamentals is important, and that totally makes sense. I've experienced that in my own training materials sometimes, where I've gotten great positive feedback from people who have said, hey, I really like that blog post, but I don't know what you mean by a minor 11th. Like, I don't know what you mean by that. And then I'm like, oh, I need to send you to this other blog post that's going to explain to you what that means. So I totally understand where you're coming from. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Yeah, there is a lot of theoretical elements involved in jazz, but the good news that everybody should take a lot of encouragement from today who's listening is that none of the greatest jazz musicians in the world that either living today or the guys that innovated it or the ones that started it, if you can say only a certain group of people started it, they learned all this music by ear. In fact, there are some musicians that I have met before that literally don't even know the names of the notes on their instrument. They've just have great ears and they can start playing this stuff. Of course, having the theoretical knowledge and, like I said, the fundamentals of your instrument is really important. But it's not going to, if you really want to be exposed to it, like you said, you have to listen to this music, right? If you want to become a great rock musician, listen to it. If you want to become a specific style within rock, listen to it. If you want to become a great folk musician, I mean, I'm generalizing styles here. We can get really detailed. Listen, and you'll eventually start to get it. And combined with some private instruction provided, with some sources from online, perhaps, you can start to piece together this puzzle piece together.
Fantastic. And you've maybe touched on it there, but the other big question that comes up in our audience when the topic of jazz comes up is, it's kind of the great theory versus ears debate. I think jazz is associated with both, having really complex theory and also having an amazing ear. Yeah. And some people think you just need one or you just need the other. I'd love to hear your perspective. If you want to become a good jazz musician, maybe not, world leading, maybe not innovative, what's most important?
Mm-hmm. I hands down would say the ear is the most important. In general, when it comes to improvisation, which jazz is a music that is mostly based off of improvisation. I mean, there's so many different styles of jazz, but the general basic traditional law of jazz, I guess you could say, is you play a melody and then everybody takes a solo. Everybody says their piece. It's sort of like a little democracy, like, okay, now it's your turn. Now you tell me what you think. And then you tell me what you think. You tell me what you think. Okay, now let's all join together at the end and say something. At least that's how it's supposed to work, right? So, that's kind of how that goes. It's a music based around improvisation. And when it comes to becoming a great improviser, having a great ear is way more important than knowing what scale to play over this chord or, any kind of theory like that. In fact, sometimes I'll even go this far, Christopher, to say, and there's people that might disagree with me, but sometimes I think that scales and thinking about scales in order to play over chords or chord progressions can be a barrier for actually creating great music. It can actually stop you from creating great melodies. And scales are great. I think they're really important if you think about them in the right way. And all that theory that's attached to scales. But at the end of the day, if you have a great ear, I mean, that's hands down. I would take that in a student any day than someone who's just like, I know everything there is to know about theory. It's like, that's great. You have all that knowledge, but can you actually make music with it? I think that's the big thing at the end of the day for me. So I would hands down say theory's great, but ears all the way.
Fantastic. I love that explanation, and it gels really well with the way we approach improvisation at Musical U, which is to say theory can be really helpful, and the idea of a fixed chord progression or a fixed scale can really help you when you're starting out in improvisation by giving you kind of a safe zone where the notes you pick are going to sound okay. But actually the trap is, and particularly with, rock guitarists are the classic example, but you can get trapped in those patterns and those ideas and frameworks where you're just playing robotically. You're not actually hearing what you play before you play it. You just play it and see what comes out. And I love that you've explained that what lets you get beyond that is the ears, because that's very much our philosophy. And I think it's what you need to really feel free as an improviser.
Yeah. Christopher, I like to think about scales, and maybe this will help your audience to think about it, but I like to think of scales as pitch collections. And what I mean by pitch collections is, it's sort of like a map of the notes that you can use. They're really guidelines. It's not like a definite, if you stray outside of this, then you're going to be in trouble, but they're a map of notes that you can use. So it's not necessarily a play it in this order, or this note has to be followed by this note. It's simply a map of if you can visualize on your instrument, where things are, then that can be really helpful. So scales aren't a means necessarily to create music. They're just a structure. They're pitch collections that can help you visualize the notes that you can play.
That's a really helpful mindset, I think, for people to get that balance between safety and freedom in improvisation. That's great advice. So you are the man behind LearnJazzStandards.com. I think I first discovered the site when I was learning walking bass lines. I was playing bass and I needed the set of chords to play some jazz standards. And you have this huge database of jazz standards with all the information people would require. But you also have a lot of teaching material on the site too. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what they can discover at LearnJazzStandards.com and how it can help them with some of the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So LearnJazzStandards.com really just came out of the place of having a resource for people to learn jazz standards. I guess that's why it's called that, and so that's always been something from the very beginning, where we do have a database where you can, read a bio about the song. There's a play along that we uploaded like years ago, tons of play alongs onto YouTube of these songs that you can practice along with, and chord charts so you can follow along, just like a place to learn jazz standards. But over the years, it's become, so much more than that. We have a podcast, the LJS podcast, where every single week I'm, interviewing people just like you're interviewing me, and talking about music and jazz. And I also do a lot of solo shows where I'm just giving out jazz tips and advice. And also on our blog, you can find all of that stuff too. Just, whether you're just interested in jazz and you're not, you just want to dip your toe in, there's something there for everybody that they can look up, or if they have a question. My goal always when I'm creating content for learnjazzstandards.com is to think about what questions could people possibly have. And if they type that into my search bar, would they find that question? And so, I might not have the answer to every question, but I'm working on it. So you can try me and see if that's happening or not. But it's really a place for everybody, whether you're just starting out, whether you're an intermediate player, or maybe even if you're an advanced player, you can still get some value from what we have at learnjazzstandards.com.
Awesome. And I think one thing I love about the site is, apart from the huge database of jazz standards, you have these great portal pages where people can dive in to learn specific things and kind of navigate their way through all of the blog posts and tutorials you have there. So yeah, I think if anyone listening is intrigued and wants to get into jazz at whatever level, definitely take a look at the website. I'm a huge fan of the Learn Jazz Standards podcast. It's one that is definitely on my listening rota each week. And September for you guys...
Thanks so much, man. Appreciate it.
For September, you were doing ear training month. And I definitely encourage anyone listening to this show to go and check that out, because you did some really powerful episodes on intervals, chords, chord progressions, and more. And this was leading up to the launch of your brand new ear training course. Can you tell us a bit about that, Brent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to. And I also like to say right up front, like for those listening, that I have like a really great freebie to give to your audience today. I'm really excited about this freebie. So I'm not going to tell you it is yet, because, I don't want you to, I want you to listen to the rest. But so I will talk about the course though. Yeah, the course is called How to Play What You Hear. And, when I think about ear training, and this is a course, by the way, not just for jazz musicians. This is a course for everybody. Everybody can get some value out of this course, no matter what kind of music you play or what you're going for. But when I think about ear training, I try to think about what is the end goal of ear training. Like, is it just simply like, what's the point of hearing intervals? What's the point of hearing chords? What's the point of hearing chord progressions? The point of it is so that you can play what you're hearing in your head. And I've heard that. I get emails all the time from people asking me questions like, how do I learn songs by ear? How do I learn solos by ear? How do I play the music that I'm hearing in my head? And that got me just thinking a lot. And I started reaching out to colleagues, asking them, how did you get to this point in your musicianship? And I started looking back at myself, at my college days, and I became convinced that the fundamentals of ear training are critical. They're crucial for becoming a better musician in general and playing what you hear. So at the end of the day, why do we ear train? It's so that we can play what we're hearing in our head. So the course is called How to Play What You Hear, and it walks you through my 4 steps for playing what you hear. And those 4 steps are, number 1, hearing intervals, not just recognizing them, but also being able to sing them. Like if you heard a reference note, could you sing a major 6 up from that? Could you sing a minor 3rd down from that? And then step number 2 is hearing chords. So being able to recognize, what does a major triad sound like? And if that sounds intimidating to anybody, you'll learn what that is. What is a triad? It's 3 notes. You'll learn what that is. Everything is explained. But, if I heard a major triad, could I recognize it? But even further than that, could I actually sing the arpeggio? Can I sing the chord tones? Could I pick out what the 3rd or the 5th or the root is? And again, if that's over your head right now, that's all explained pretty clearly. And then step number 3 is hearing chord progressions, because like a big part of playing what you hear is being able to hear a song. And I mean, imagine for a second, like, again, no matter what genre of music, if you heard a song on the radio and you just automatically knew what those chords were, like, wouldn't that just like, I don't like when people say change your life that much, because it's like, well, it's a strong statement, but it could change your musical life, right? If you could actually do that. And so the step number 3 is all about, hearing chord progressions. And And it's amazing in the course how you learn how intervals influences if you can learn chords, and chords influences if you can learn chord progressions. It's sort of like a stepwise process. And then step number 4 is translating what you hear to your instrument. And this is a really important step because at the end of the day, we got these fundamentals of ear training, right? It's sort of like, you would sort of think of it like the scales of learning your instrument. I mean, maybe you could consider it like that. Well, there's this part missing though, and that's the connecting what you're hearing to your instrument, right? I mean, whether it's learning a song, whether it's improvising or anything, or just playing a melody, you need to be able to make that connection. And a lot of musicians don't have that connection. It's like the instrument and their ear are separate entities. And what we want to do is we want to build that relationship with each other, right? And eventually, the ultimate goal, and I'm still working towards it. I think everybody's working towards this stuff for the rest of their life. We want it to be one solid unit. We want the instrument and the ear to be the same thing, right? Like when you see the best musicians in the world play, it's almost as if like they're not playing an instrument. They're just, I don't know what they're doing. They're just playing, and that instrument is just the vessel for them to express and create music. And so that's what step number 4 is. So it's steps 1 through 4. It's hearing intervals, hearing chords, hearing chord progressions, and finally translating what you hear to your instrument. And in this course, I just kind of walk you through this process of how to actually do that.
Fantastic. And for anyone listening who is thinking to themselves, well, I've seen ear training before, or I've heard about interval recognition apps before, I'd love to just point out 2 really powerful things you said there, Brent, that I love are part of your course. And the first is that you incorporate singing. And, you know, we've had an episode of the show all about worrying that you're tone deaf and whether you can sing in tune. I just say, you know, you don't have to be a star singer to leverage your voice to train your ears. It's such a powerful technique, and I love that that's included in your course. The other really critical thing is, as you said there, step 4 is connecting with your instrument, because so many musicians make the mistake of doing ear training totally isolated from anything else, or maybe connected with music theory, but that's it. And we've just found time and again what makes the difference to people actually succeeding and enjoying and using their ear training is that connection to the instrument. So I'd really encourage anyone listening to take those 2 things seriously. That really does set this course apart from a lot of the other material that's out there.
Oh, thanks a lot, Christopher. I appreciate it. And yeah, absolutely. Singing is really important because it's sort of the difference between, you know, if you can hear an interval, you can hear a chord. That's really helpful to be able to recognize that and put a name to it. But it's only one step of it. To really, truly know if you've internalized those sounds, which is ultimately what we're going for, is if you can actually reproduce that yourself. And in the course, I talk about if you feel really uncomfortable singing, because sometimes for a lot of people, actually, like singing, it's hard to actually hold a pitch. And I totally understand that. I mean, I don't consider myself a bad singer, but I sometimes, just the technique of my voice, I don't work on it every day like a vocalist might. But you can hum or you can whistle too. And a lot of people feel more comfortable with that. The whole idea is that you're just able to make some sound yourself that will produce the pitch and essentially prove that, you know, you can actually hear that. You can hear that sound.
So apart from heading to learnjazzstandards.com and tuning into the Learn Jazz Standards podcast, if someone is listening and wants to get involved with this new ear training course, where's the best place for them to go, or how can they take that first step?
I'm so glad you asked. So I mentioned before, I mentioned before that I have a freebie for your audience, and I really think that anybody, again, of any style of music, not just jazz, any skill level can benefit from this. And I want to give you, it's the ultimate ear training blueprint and a video training series. It's a great handout. It's completely free, and I'm just giving it away. Basically just kind of walking you through those 4 steps that I just talked about in a little video series. And also at the same time, just a little PDF ebook for you to follow along, the ultimate ear training blueprint. So if you want to check that out, just go to learnjazzstandards.com/musicality, and you can find that there and get started.
Terrific. Thank you so much for setting that up. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today, Brent. Thank you for joining us.
Christopher, thank you so much. And I really appreciate everything you're doing at Musical U. It's really important to spread music education to other people. And so I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Unlock your full musicality with Musical U membership. Find out more at musicalitypodcast.com/join.
That was great fun. I feel like we really busted some myths with Brent today. For a lot of people, jazz can seem advanced and intimidating on a few fronts. The music theory seems complex, and it seems like you need to know it all before you can play jazz. It seems like you need a really great ear to be able to improvise, and the idea of improvising a solo or playing from just a simple lead sheet can seem way out of reach. Talking to Brent, it was clear that none of these need to be a barrier if you want to get involved in jazz. We talked about his own journey of teaching himself by ear, and then learning with instructors who also placed a heavy emphasis on the ear. He said that the greatest jazz musicians never studied the theory, they relied heavily on their ears, and that the theory doesn't actually need to be that complicated anyway. Brent says that any genre can be complex if you look at the really great musicians in that genre, and any genre can be made simple and accessible. Jazz is no exception. If you know your way around your instrument, meaning you have the basic playing technique, you maybe know some scales and how to play some chords or arpeggios, he says that is enough to start learning jazz. Through the website learnjazzstandards.com, Brent is providing some great teaching material to help you learn the concepts you need, and also to apply it directly to the most well-known jazz tunes. For Brent, the key to learning to improvise and to play jazz is to make use of scales and theory concepts, but not to let them limit you. Instead, use your ear to go beyond and feel free. From talking a lot to his fellow jazz musicians, Brent discovered that the key to playing what you hear is to do fundamental ear training. He's created a 4-step course which covers intervals, chords, chord progressions, and applying it all on your instrument. To me, what makes this course stand out is that you'll make use of your voice to train your ears, and that you'll connect it right away with practical instrument skills. We've seen at Musicality how those two things can dramatically improve the results you get from ear training. So if you're interested to explore jazz music, definitely head on over to learnjazzstandards.com and tune in to the Learn Jazz Standards podcast. And if you want to know more about the 4-step process of ear training that Brent talked about, he's set up that generous freebie for the Musicality podcast audience. That's at learnjazzstandards.com/musicality. And we'll have the links to all those things in the show notes for this episode. I hope this conversation has inspired you today, and whether you want to start learning jazz yourself, or you're just interested to hear that it may not be as complex in terms of theory or ear skills as you had imagined, I hope you will check out the LJS resources to help you learn more. As Brent said, you might find that learning just a few concepts from the world of jazz has a great impact on your musicality, whatever genre you love and play. Thanks for listening to this episode. And stay tuned for our next one, where we'll be talking about something that thankfully Brent avoids in his new course, the ear training trap.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's music